Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mikkel. I'd like to welcome you all to this webinar that we'll be hosting. I should inform you that this webinar is being recorded and the slides will be sent out to you participants afterwards. We'll have a Q&A session at the end of the webinar. If you want to ask a question, you can write it in the chat window, and we will then pose the questions to our speaker at the end of the webinar. I'd like to introduce to you the speaker for this webinar. It's Tim Ward from CluedIn, who will take us through his experience with working with companies to make them data-driven whilst maintaining GDPR compliance. Over to you, Tim.
Thank you, Mikkel. I will also echo Mikkel's welcome to everyone. We really appreciate the time that you have taken to be in this webinar. The main focus of today's webinar, as Mikkel alluded to, is really our practice and our experiences with helping companies become data-driven while still maintaining high levels of compliance, mainly set out by the recent GDPR regulation. And there's a lot of irony that sometimes, and a lot of myth that sometimes comes with this topic. We get a lot of questions from companies, can in fact a company be data-driven and GDPR compliant at the same time? And so we'll be spending the next approximately 45 minutes together giving you all a rundown of our experiences over the last 24 to 18 months of making and helping companies become a lot more data-driven while still maintaining this level of compliance. As Mikkel said, my name is Tim Ward. I am the CEO of CluedIn, a company based out of Copenhagen, Denmark. I'm predominantly have experience with as an engineer, really around the topics of search and data analysis. It's in fact only been over the last 5 years that I've been predominantly focusing on data integration, data governance, and really all of the components that surround this topic of big data. So what we do at CluedIn is we help companies build what we call the data fabric. And you can think of the translation of a data fabric as essentially your company data connected into one place where a lot of the regular cleaning and data preparation that's necessary to integrate data across the business is actually automated for you. Also importantly, we give management the ability to govern and set service level agreements of the quality and accuracy of the data that sits across this fabric. And the fabric is typically fueled by data that sits in SaaS applications, on-premise software such as SharePoint and Exchange, custom databases, but also combined with external data sources. So for example, in Denmark, we have the CVR registry. In the US, there is the SEC, and you can also purchase services from providers such as Data.com, Hoover's, Duns & Bradstreet. What we think is most important about this company data fabric is that it's accessible. So we provide a platform that makes data across the business that is typically scattered and siloed, accessible to the business, knowing that when the business is accessing this data, they know that there are certain levels of accuracy and quality that this data is meeting. So as a company at CluedIn, we focus on providing the company data fabric so that our customers can focus on the use cases. And one of the use cases I will be focusing on today is compliance and GDPR. However, one of the interesting takeaways from this webinar should be that the same work is involved to become or provide a technical underpinning for a compliant GDPR solution is very similar, if not the same, to the type of work that's required to fuel some of the other use cases you can see here, such as machine learning, knowing more about your customers, and innovation. So without a lot of companies actually being aware of it, businesses were just handed the single best excuse to become a data-driven company. And this excuse came in the format of GDPR, of course. So what we'll be discussing today is what we call the 6 pillars. So first of all, we need to look at the current landscape of technology when it comes to data. And we will be covering off what we call the data landscape. This is fundamental to really understand what are all the core components that are necessary for a business to become much more data-driven. Then, of course, we'll step into the reality. So over the last 24 to 18 months, how have our customers treated the GDPR in reality? We'll be hearing from the actual customers themselves. So what are the customers saying about their investment that was made into becoming a much more data-driven business, and also to put this investment into providing a technical underpinning for the GDPR. It would be, it would not be a CluedIn presentation without focusing on some of the technology. And of course, we will be focusing also on the value. So what was the value that these customers received from implementing a GDPR solution? And what was really the value that they took in taking that leap and investing in technology to help them in the data-driven space, the GDPR space? And we would be remiss without highlighting some of the challenges that arose in this process. At CluedIn, we've been spending the last 5 years in helping companies become data-driven. And what we have built over this 5 years is what we call the data landscape. These are all the components that we have found necessary to provide a successful solution with customers to become data-driven. And when most people look at this, they seem quite overwhelmed by the amount of components that are necessary to provide the business with good quality data accessible across the entire stack. And we agree. And CluedIn really, we focus on the parts highlighted in green. And we lean onto the shoulders of giants really to help in stitching together the other parts and components to really fulfill this data landscape story. And the key takeaway that I want you to take away from this particular slide is that the data fabric we see as the clear abstraction from data to the business. In the businesses that we were talking with, there was an obvious pattern. And that was that the business is not as much focused on wanting to know, will the data fabric scale? Which cloud provider are we using? Are we running backups? Where are those backups located? But much more focused on, I want access to the data that is typically scattered across our business. And we really see the data fabric as one of the keys for businesses to be able to innovate and accelerate as businesses, especially when data is the fuel behind that acceleration. Like I said, we have spent the last 18 months in helping companies become GDPR compliant. And when we first started talking with these companies, there was a common theme. And that was when we broke down the amount of time these companies were spending on becoming data-driven. It usually fell into these 3 parts of the pyramid. It started with organizational effort. So a large percentage of the time to become data-driven was spent in establishing processes, researching technology, discussions around security and privacy and compliance, not to mention, the typical politics that can spawn from very large businesses. And the majority of time was spent in data preparation. And if you work in this world of data, you can't go far on media sites on the internet without seeing topics and discussions around that people working in the data space spend anywhere from 60 to 80% of their time in just cleaning and preparing data. Apologies, sorry, I should be sharing my slides. So I'll just repeat that the breakdown of time that is spent in this particular case of becoming data-driven really comes down to the amount of time that's spent in the organizational effort and the data preparation. So here are some of the companies that have transitioned with CluedIn to become much more data-driven. And the interesting part about these use cases is these companies are all utilizing and applying different use cases to the problem. The core problem they're wanting to solve is, can we get access to the data that sits across our business? So with taking these particular companies, one of the interesting ways that they've transitioned this effort and how it has moved for them is obviously that the organizational efforts and the data preparation, that's still something that happens in the overall process of becoming data-driven. However, a lot more time is actually spent in the business use cases in applying this good quality data to, for example, machine learning, to applying it to business intelligence, to advanced analytics, to applying it to building a universal, unified view of the customer, and finally to applying it to the GDPR use case as well. There was one theme that was common across all of these companies that transitioned with CluedIn, and that was the work that was involved for them to provide a technical underpinning for the GDPR compliance was very similar, if not the same work that was needed to become much more data-driven as a business. And let me explain what they meant by this. It's also worth mentioning before I head into the explanation that becoming data-driven, becoming GDPR compliant at the same time, it's not just something that we saw was solved with technology. And in fact, the main two ways that we interacted with these customers was a varying degree of use of technology and process. So we had multiple companies that took the decision to rely much more on the underlying technology to help them in the GDPR case. And we saw another mix of companies that had already established quite a lot of processes of how to process these subject access requests. We also had a lot of processes around, how to clean and integrate data across the business, but they didn't necessarily have the technical underpinning to help them in that case. And so really, if we look at this from a high level, the process to build a proper data fabric, and this does not really matter if you choose to go with a platform like CluedIn or not. There's some pivotal foundations that are necessary to provide a company with accessible, clean, accurate data across the business. And really, it can really be summed up in one sentence, and that is, data needs to be connected and integrated. There needs to be some type of cleaning mechanisms. There needs to be some type of governance so that companies can know the quality and the accuracy of data that sits within this fabric. And this allows the business to really decide, are we willing to use this data to help us make decisions and to help to provide our customers with a GDPR solution? Are we okay with that? With, for example, 85% accuracy, 88% quality, with 90% completeness of data records. One of the core fundamental pillars of the data fabric as well is to provide accessibility to this data no matter the business unit. So really, if we think about it from a technical perspective, you need to think about putting in place a solution that allows you to easily integrate data. Now, one of the key takeaways from working with our customers over the last 24 to 18 months was that although integration can be seen as a simple problem to solve, in fact, when you hit the enterprise, that's really where it starts to become quite complex. So, for example, one of the larger companies that we work with, they have 135,000 employees, and they use over 120 different, quite large applications to fuel their business. When you get to that type of scale, we really need to start thinking about not only integrating data, but how far can we scale this, and how do we work with different types of authentication mechanisms rather than simple usernames and passwords. When you're working with enterprise customers, it's much more about working with things like certificates and Active Directory. Now, one of the key pillars also behind the data fabric is that we need some type of mechanism to be able to help clean and triangulate the data. And by triangulate, a good example would be, I need to figure out that Mark Smith in one system and Marcus Smith from another source are actually the same person. Now, there's a lot of complexities that come in this process. And this process, really, one of the things it helps with is deduplication of data. And finally, we need to be able to form a connected view of this data. And I wanted to highlight two of the important approaches that are necessary for this to receive high precision, that are really much more modern techniques. The first is taking a machine learning approach to automating a lot of this cleaning of data. And the second is to utilize an array of different database technologies to help us understand the data. Most of you on the webinar that work in the data space will know that the most way that we solve this today is with the kind of data warehouse approach. And this is typically based on either a relational type of database or a columnar type of database. And really, one of the things that we lean on in our platform is that there are more than 15 different types of database families today, and they have all been engineered to solve very specific things in the data world. And finally, it's important to have this kind of consistent layer of querying the data across the business. A querying layer that not only supports the ability to for data engineers to query this data, but also business units to query this data as well. So one of the ways we helped our customers really accelerate through and become a much more data-driven business sooner than thought, and accelerate to this kind of, do I have a good technical underpinning of my data to serve my customers from a GDPR compliance perspective? It really starts with selecting something that a product that has pre-built a lot of the integrations to the most common of services that exist in the enterprise. So obviously these spawn from tools like Salesforce and Dynamics, but also it really needs to touch on things like Lotus Notes, Oracle databases, and of course the hybrid ability to work with on-premise environments and cloud providers as well. So to have a look at the technical components that our customers really needed to be able to make them much more data-driven, but always have this confidence that when they were using their data, they knew they were using it in compliance with the law. They knew that they had consent to use the data in the particular use cases that they were wanting to provide. And this is typically where the myth arises around, the GDPR was here to really, for lack of a better word, kind of kill the progress on data-driven companies. And this myth is just really not true. as long as you're providing, foundations of being able to have some way of semantically telling this data fabric what can you use this particular subset of data for, then this really gives businesses the confidence they need to accelerate and innovate in quite a fast-paced data world. So as I mentioned before, it really starts with simple integration. So the ability to integrate data from different sources. And this is typically the reason why we saw a lot of companies burning in starting this type of work, because the sheer amount of engineering work and project management work in finding internal staff that knew how to integrate with those systems, but also maintain those integrations over time. You can obviously imagine it's quite a tedious and costly process. The next was having this cleaning and enriching and validating engine to help automate a lot of the cleaning. And by cleaning, I mean, this typical process of normalizing data across the business, making sure that there's consistency in the data, and making sure, these common problems of data entry, people putting a phone number in an email field accidentally. So, you need a system that can help automate a lot of this cleaning for you. However, there is no magic bullet to this. So what's important to have is also intuitive data cleaning tools that allow data engineers, but more specifically the business users that are close to the context of the data, to be able to steward and curate and help the overall data culture of a business. I also mentioned accessibility, and this is really, are there efficient ways to pull this data out of the fabric and serve other parts of the business? Privacy enabled needs to be something that's designed into the platform, and whether this is partly via consent management, data policies, retention policies, these are core critical parts of providing the business with a good data fabric. I also mentioned the connected view, and really this is about being able to unify data that is somehow related to each other. And one of the mechanisms that we use and the technologies that we use to help with this is the use of a graph database. And this really helps us model the data. Of course, it wouldn't be a data fabric without being able to search across all of the data that sits within the sources. And one of the things I'll finally mention, of course, for the GDPR specific use case is that a lot of the identification of personal information, a lot of that can be automated today. Finding emails, finding credit cards, and where it really becomes complex is finding job titles, something that doesn't have known structures. And that's really where you need to take modern approaches to solving this problem. So of course, it wouldn't be a webinar without a demonstration. So I will head over to my browser and I will show you what this looks like to be a GDPR compliant company while maintaining proper data-driven functionality with CluedIn. So what you see here is the CluedIn web platform. So this is the out-of-the-box web application that sits over our company data fabric. And of course, we support all types of authentication, so single sign-on, two-factor authentication to log in. So as I log into my application, what you are exposed to immediately is the data fabric at CluedIn. So this is our company's data fabric. So you kind of get a hint here of some of the tools that we use up here in our launch pad. So these are just some of the applications that we use at CluedIn to solve our back office problems. Things like sending mail and communicating, running webinars, social accounts, CRM, etc. And one of the first places you always start with the fabric is integrating data. And like I said, becoming a data-driven business is all about how easy and how approachable is it to actually start integrating the data. So as you can see at CluedIn, we use 96 different applications. And some would say there's a lot, but one of the feedback that we got back from working with our customers over the last 18 months was that, once the analysis was actually done of how many internal tools there were, it actually became a surprise the amount of software that was used within their enterprises. And to be able to add new integrations to the data fabric, it's just a matter of choosing from our large list of applications and authenticating with the source. So for example, Office 365, logging in with your account, and then you're essentially done. Those tools are now in sync. And of course, for many different providers, there's the ability to set up configuration of what different parts of that application you would like to bring in. But really, when it comes to starting with CluedIn, it's really as simple as choosing the tools you use, authenticating, and now that application is in sync with CluedIn. So as you can see here is a whole list of applications that we currently have plugged into our data fabric. And essentially what you're looking at here is all of the accounts across all our software stack. So really this is a good view into the data that sits across our business. And as a manager, one of the things that I really want to start with, especially when I'm wanting to become data-driven and compliant at the same time, is to head over to our data governance section, where you start to see reports and dashboards around the encryption levels of the data that sits within our fabric, what types of data that we actually do have. And as you can see, we have around 102,000 people in our fabric. And these people could have come from the CRM system or social accounts or mentioned within emails. This really starts to give us a good insight into what data we have available across our business. Now, also when it comes to proper data governance, it's also important that you have the ability to set consent for the data that you have across these tools. So CluedIn has an inbuilt consent management system that allows me to specifically identify data controllers, or in this case, data sources and tools. We use HubSpot as our CRM system. And here's a good example of me showing that, well, for a person's data to be compliant in HubSpot, I need to make sure that I have consent for their email address, their first name, their last name, and their IP address. Now, the importance of this is that when I'm using the fabric now, I can make sure that CluedIn does all of the work to only bring me back the data that I have consent to be able to use in the use case that I'm after. Obviously, with built-in support for things like setting up retention periods of the data, getting a data catalog of all of the data that's available across all my different tools. So for example, if I was to look up annual revenue, I can see there are multiple different sources of where we store the annual revenue of a particular company. And I can just drill through to that and see a breakdown of the type of data, whether it's editable, removable, where it could contain personally identifying information. So now I get the ability to, of course, look into my data and explore it. And one of the obvious ways to be able to do that is via search. So as I open up my search results, you get a good view of, okay, wow, I actually have access to all of the data across my business in one consistent search interface. And I get the ability to drill down and filter and pivot my data by different types of companies, people, sources of integration, and of course, not to mention the type of data itself. And for something as simple as searching for GDPR, you can see that I've searched across my stack, and now I have brought all the results back that exist across our different sets of tools that contain some information about the regulation itself. So drilling down to something like presentations, I can start to see here are some of the presentations that we have available with GDPR as one of the topics being discussed. Now, what this also makes it interesting for is the case of the GDPR. Now, for most of you by now, you're probably aware of, what is required from the regulation itself. There's parts of that require portability of data and the ability to request information from a company, and of course, the ability to ask for the right to be removed from the data sources as well. So directly within the fabric, I can actually request this data. And one of the ways that this is made possible is the fact that CluedIn has been able to, in its fabric, unify the data around individuals into one single place. So let's have a look at what this looks like. So at CluedIn, when we receive these data subject requests, we have an official process where we get emailed and we are contacted via online forms via our website. And essentially, I get to go through a process of validation in making sure that this person is a member of the EU and that they've properly identified themselves, and then I can proceed. So for this particular case, I'm going to look up a mutual friend of CluedIn, a former colleague, Alex. I'm going to click proceed. And then CluedIn is going to go off and try to find me the most relevant person within these records. Now, one thing to mention here is that as I zoom in, you can see that it's important that there are not multiple Alex Shivas here. And the information that we have gathered from Alex has come from multiple different sources. In fact, if I click on Alex to go see his full view, I can see that some of the data that we have on Alex has come from him tweeting us on social networks. Of course, we have some information from him in some of our Google contacts, and a little bit of information on him in our CRM system. So this ability to see this full connected view of Alex obviously helps when we're trying to respond to these data subject requests in an efficient time. So I'm going to select Alex and I'm going to click next. And what this is going to do is it's going to go off and scan the fabric, and it's going to start to build a report around Alex. It's going to try and highlight all of the mail items, of course, all the communication and events, all the social information that sits within this fabric, and then produce a full breakdown report of what I would be able to send to Alex in his portability request or request for data. So we get a breakdown of categorization of identifiers, we get a breakdown of the properties and where this data actually came from. But as we go down the report, we also get indications of where we officially got this data from, and what are their levels of privacy? What are their levels of encryption that they maintain in the source? And finally, a full breakdown of all of the attached records that we have that somehow personally identify Alex in some way. So we've got some activity, we've got some announcements on social accounts, and so forth. Now, I can also download this report. Now, for those of you who have been working in the GDPR space, you'll know that one important part of this as well is the ability to send this data to another data controller on request. So this is something that just comes out of the box with CluedIn and allows me to send an export in a machine readable format to a particular data controller on Alex's request. So I'm going to accept this request. I'm not going to send this to Alex. And then really, this is where it becomes interesting, because not only can I now subscribe to Alex in the data fabric, making sure that if new data comes in on Alex now, I'm notified immediately so I can generate an updated report for him. But I can also action all of the parts of the subject access request directly within the CluedIn platform as well. Now, one of the common requests would be to change or rectify data. And I can just go over here and I can actually go to some of the data that I have on Alex. And I can go down to some of the things that he's requested for us to change. So for example, I'll just change something here. I'll change something like the offline, the original source. So I'll change this from offline and I will change that to online and click request. Now what this is going to do is it's going to queue up these changes for me to be able to actually fix this data in the source. So as you can see over here on the left-hand side, it's actually giving me an explicit list of commands that it's going to run against the actual source of HubSpot to make this change and to make the whole part of deleting and rectifying and minifying data something that can be done within minutes, if not under an hour, instead of the large timeframes that companies are taking to do this in a manual approach. Now with around 25 minutes left in the webinar, what I wanted to highlight was, okay, this sounds, very restrictive in a way. I've now got all of these policies in place. I've got these consent policies that say, I can only use certain parts of data under certain use cases. And of course, this is just the status quo. This is, what businesses, as businesses, to be compliant businesses, we need to be able to do. But I want to show you some of the other ways that you can maintain being a data-driven business with this high level of compliance. Now, one of the ways that you can interact with the data fabric is through our API. And with our API, we expose a querying language called GraphQL. And GraphQL allows me to simply write queries that are very, very simple, but they're very powerful in what they're actually doing. So I have a query here that is essentially saying, go please find me mail that has come from Gmail as a data source. And I want you to bring out the total results. I want you to bring out the actual entries. And for now, let's just keep this to bringing back the name, the provider origins of where this data came from, and all of the metadata and the properties. So as I run this, you can see how quick this is to be able to return results across our entire stack of data. And as you can see here in the results, well, here is a full breakdown of all of the results where I don't actually need to know how to talk to the Gmail API. I don't need to know how to talk to the Salesforce API. I have one universal querying language that allows me just to say, hey, I want to bring back organizations. I don't really care where they come from. And you can actually see that it's brought back these records. But what CluedIn has been able to do is to say, oh, hey, I know this company. I've got a little bit of data on it from AngelList. I've got a little bit of data from it on the CVR registry. I've got a little bit from Facebook Graph, from Glassdoor. And then here's some information from it in HubSpot, our internal CRM system. So you can start to see how CluedIn has been able to kind of join this data across the data source to really unify these records into one unified view. And so what you're really hoping for in the end is that as we type in our good friend Alex Sheba, that we have one record of Alex where we have been able to unify his records across the different sources to plug into our data fabric. So as businesses, to make sure that you can accelerate into being much more data-driven, some of the ways that you can do this is by using this GraphQL query language. And so if I just jump over to a common use case, which would be data visualization for business intelligence, it's important to establish that, in fact, the data that fuels these charts is directly fueled from the fabric. And the most important difference is that if I was to plug these Power BI or Tableau or business intelligence tools directly into the actual services? Well, there's not something there within the middle that's actually guaranteeing me that it's cleaning the data, that it's deduplicating and merging records. And most importantly, from a governance perspective, there's no real levels of SLAs on the quality and the accuracy that me as a business owner can look here and know that I should use these charts with a certain level of confidence. And the same can be said for machine learning. So this same data fabric and same querying language can be used to fuel a lot of these machine learning processes. So one good example of this would be some of the techniques we use to, will this particular sales lead become a customer? And one of the core concepts of being a data-driven business comes down to this foundation. Is it actually easy to access the data necessary to get these types of decisions in place from across the business? Or are you running into the common bottlenecks of we need to talk to the right internal stakeholders to export the data, then I need to give it to the data team to clean it, and then I need to give it to the governance team to curate and steward it over time? And this is really where the data fabric becomes extremely valuable for a business. So then what are our customers saying? When we were talking to our customers after they had put the data fabric in place, there was one unanimous theme and pattern that came from those groups of customers. And that was that the GDPR was the perfect catalyst they needed to also become a data-driven business at the same time. And one of the core reasons why was that just from a technical perspective, the same work that they needed to make sure that they were giving their customers clean and accurate data across the different data sources, the ability to actually find all locations of an individual, the ability to guarantee the transparency, not to mention the efficiency of being able to give a person their data within a necessary time frame. This was very similar, if not the same work that was needed to make sure they could fuel the machine learning wing of their business, or the business intelligence part of their business, or knowing more about their customer. We also surveyed these same customers to ask them why did they choose to invest in a GDPR technical solution when there was a lot of umming and ahhing about, can we actually solve this from a business process perspective? And these were the main reasons why our customers came back to us in saying that there was very much huge value that came from us taking that leap into providing a good GDPR technical solution. And the first was knowing more about your customer. Obviously, this is one of the side effects of being able to locate all the data on an individual, is also that you can understand the historical data of this customer as well. But from a kind of a more social aspect, one of the other reasons was their ability to offer full customer transparency. So the ability for also these customers to self-service their data subject requests. Obviously, high data governance was another big win for these companies. The ability for them, just from an operational perspective, to know what was the quality, the accuracy, the completeness, and the relevance of the data that sat across their business. And more from a forward-thinking approach, it was, now that we have this fabric in place, how can we start to accelerate the innovation departments within our business as well? So some of the quick wins that these companies saw that actually allowed them to save money through this process. And I can guarantee you, when we just started talking to these companies, when it was really around this GDPR case, one of the core themes and patterns we saw was that the GDPR is not a cost-saving type of scenario. And of course, this was something that we also discovered as the provider of products throughout these types of engagements as well. And the first was around the fact that a lot of these companies went through a strict retention period type of process, where they really critically looked at the data they had across their business and said, do we really need this data? If we don't require it from a regulation perspective, then can we actually cull some of this historical data? And from this, of course, were large savings in storage and processing, backups, and archiving of that data as well. We also saw a tendency for a lot of companies to actually use tools that were upstream from the data fabric itself. So translation, tools that would receive their data from the CluedIn data fabric, that they took this quite wipe and refresh approach of those platforms. So a lot of these were in the shape of a data warehouse. So taking a classical data warehouse, maybe it's SQL, in many cases it was an Oracle-based data warehouse, and to fill themselves with this confidence that, well, if we're just wiping this data warehouse and rebuilding it from the fabric, that allows us to have a higher level of confidence that we're only working with the data that we have consent for in that data warehouse. Not to mention the actual consolidation of tooling. Now, by the time that we were engaging with most of these companies, a lot of them had already gone through the process of generating a list of the tools that they used. And what we found is that a lot of these companies were able to save quite a lot of money by consolidating tools that were doing similar things within their business. And this typically fell into tools that were backup and recovery tools, archiving tools. And this was really where these customers found some quick wins. From more of a forward-thinking approach, it was also this win of knowing they now had this infrastructure in place that had a good synchronization with their sources of data that allowed them to look into other parts of the business of how they could innovate. In fact, in a few cases, we had customers that were able to put other projects actually on hold, if not cancel those projects, because those projects also had this core foundation of accessing data across the business. Now, like I said, we would be remiss without mentioning some of the challenges that we had during these engagements. And when we surveyed our customers, the top reason or challenge was really more about what they didn't know they had within their business. And this typically came into the form of generating lists of tools that they know they had internally, but also knowing that there were lots of other tools that were hard to locate. There were, especially in the larger businesses, it was about who are the product owners of those tools and do they have a good view into what data they have available to them. One of the interesting challenges we saw while we were on site with some of these customers was the ability to actually build the data culture that's necessary in a way to become a data-driven business. I think it goes without saying that for many businesses, GDPR was a disruptive happening. And really, we saw a lot of these companies, require a lot of internal training to not only get buy-in from the business, but actually the product owners themselves. And it was really this training that involved things such as, data entry. Are you being responsible when you're entering data into a system? Are product owners being responsible about retaining only the data that they need on an individual? We also saw a lot of challenges more from a technical aspect of playing the risk versus reality factor, i.e., there were many companies that took this regulation and interpreted it quite literally. And what this meant was that there were internal challenges around, we have terabytes of video data, or we have terabytes of audio data. Do we need to actually do the work to extract the PII data from that and the huge infrastructural needs to be able to cater for that amount of processing as well? And as I'm sure a couple of you on the webinar would relate to as well, would be these clashes of compliance versus IT. And this really came in the form of, do we solve these things via technology, or do we solve it via compliance and legal solutions? So then, how do you as a business get started in becoming much more data-driven while maintaining this high level of compliance? And we can't forget that GDPR is very much something that's very relevant to us in Europe and across the world right now. But we are seeing the rise of CCPA in California and the US. We are seeing similar things happen, of course, in the Philippines. And for banks specifically, by the start of next year, there will be the PSD2 out, which will require you the ability to have an API over the data that sits on individuals, so you can, in a way, make that available to third parties in the finance industry. But from our perspective, we've seen that the successful companies that have become data-driven, it really starts with just taking the leap. And whether you start with GDPR as the use case that is used to, fuel this data-driven story, and I mean, I would recommend the momentum of the GDPR is really a good place to start. Or whether you actually start from the data-driven end and work yourself back to compliance. There are three core things that I can guarantee over the next few years, and that is that company data has value. Being GDPR compliant has value, and it's mostly seen in the transparency that we can offer businesses to data subjects. And there's one more forward thinking, is that I can also tell you that the next wave of value, whether that is known now or unknown, will be based off, can you get accessible data across your business? So thank you all very much for taking your time on the webinar, and I will hand back to Mikkel now to be able to fuel if there are any questions. So I will hand back to you, Mikkel.
Yes, all right, thank you very much, Tim. I received a few questions from the audience, so we'll go through them now. The first one reads, take your example of machine learning prediction on which sales lead is going to convert into a customer. So I want to perform machine learning analysis to get the probability of conversion of all the leads, and want to utilize data, including leads, leads company profiles, sales events towards the leads, external data about the leads, etc. What is the typical work process of using data fabric to gather all these data for my machine learning analysis?
Okay, fantastic. So it really comes down to this. There's a core, obviously, difference between using lead data that is alluding to an individual versus lead data that is actually coming from company data. So I'll answer really both questions. And of course, when it comes to utilizing company data, so if we took a company like Lego, using the annual revenue, using the location, the industry, and some of the typical features you would use to build your models when you're using a machine learning approach, of course, these are things that you don't necessarily need consent for to be able to make automatic decisions off in this type of approach. So when it comes down to actually using lead information, so personal data about an individual, one of the things that we found with our customers is first the analysis of what data that you would use in those machine learning models. What data of that actually needs to be about that individual? So, typical things that you wouldn't feed into a machine learning model for that particular use case would be their name. It wouldn't really be things like their email address, right? And those are things that, of course, we could we wouldn't want to send over to these models and project out of our GraphQL query. But the things that are interesting in those cases, of course, are things like job title and things like where they work. Of course, in a very kind of personally identifying approach, it would be things like genders and ages and things like that. And the bottom line is, within CluedIn, we facilitate this through the use of the consent management system. So when I log back into the CluedIn application, basically it's about me making sure that when I go to set my consent, that I make sure that I set up a consent configuration that says, hey, I'm just about to use something like Salesforce. I'm about to use Salesforce to use their Einstein feature to detect if they are going to be a good lead or not. So really it's about going through, asking, do you actually need, is this a required amount of consent to even use this service? We obviously have some type of description. So let's just say it is detect lead score with Salesforce. And then we can actually use the out-of-the-box data catalog that comes with CluedIn to say, okay, so here are the individual properties that I actually need from Salesforce to do this job, okay? And then it's about making sure that when we go back to our list of consents that, okay, let's go to, for example, our HubSpot consent. There are ways to not only manually add a consent entry from a person, but there are also ways that you can automate this through our API. So whether that's capturing the consent through the website or through a newsletter, there is a way for us to be able to say, this particular person has said that I can use their data in this particular use case. And then really it becomes the challenge of, getting that actual consent. So what I found, to answer the question in the end and to summarize, is that really in the machine learning cases, specifically when you're using people data to do those models, and I would say with most of our customers, we don't. We're using more company information. It's really about, how much of this data can you pseudonymize or anonymize and still get value out of your models? And, what type of data can you use which cannot actually be traced back to an individual to make sure you're not breaking this consent agreement that you have with these data subjects?
Right. Let's go to the next question then. When May the 25th came into effect, how many requests were your customers receiving?
Okay. I would say there was a varying level of communication also that we had with our customers on actually asking these questions. But for the customers that we were heavily engaged with, it obviously varied. And I guess I'll take our biggest customer as an example, because to some degree they had quite a large of exposure of data subjects that would most likely put a request through. And they would come May 25th, and obviously there was a large spike for them. So it's not also worth mentioning that if you are a sub processor, you may actually be responsible for serving the data up that you have on behalf of other data processors. So we were usually seeing a spike of anywhere from 20 or 30 a day up to when certain media releases came out, such as data breaches that happened for companies. That's where we really saw this spike of individuals requesting their data across the business.
Right, thanks for that. What are the sizes of the companies you're working with? I can imagine that this is easier to solve for smaller companies.
Okay, that's a good question. Once again, it does vary. At CluedIn, we mainly focus on mid to enterprise-sized businesses, and a lot of that comes around the integration support that we have is typically for the larger enterprise tools like Workday and ServiceNow and SAP and Oracle-based systems as well. So we have less exposure to the smaller companies in helping them become GDPR compliant. I think when it comes down to it, the problem doesn't necessarily spawn from the amount of data to process. I mean, that's something that is scalable. The process came really down to how structured and how well managed was the original source data, and how much work did the CluedIn platform need to do to actually I guess to clean the data and to identify where all this personal information came from. So I'll focus mainly on the kind of enterprise businesses, and I guess the sizes were mainly from 1,000 employees and up, and these were typically global businesses. So the problems that this introduced would have been things like, content that's in different languages. And so we were working with anywhere from 1,000 employees to 135,000 employees.
Right. Next question. Could this be used for PSD2?
Okay. Yeah, as I mentioned in the presentation, PSD2 essentially is targeted mainly towards banking and financial industries. But essentially one of the core technical decisions or ideas behind the GDPR was, can I locate all of the personal data on an individual across my business? And then when it comes to PSD2, it's a very similar problem set. It is, can I expose APIs that give external applications access to the data that we have on our customers? So I would definitely say that, yes, you can. If you're in the banking industry, you can utilize this as a very accelerated PSD2 solution.
Great. Last question. What percentage of right for portability or request for data or request for deletion are your customers seeing?
Okay. Once again, this varied per customer, but I would say there was a clear winner, which was the request for the data itself. And the portability from our customers, we didn't hear too much about that. And I would only be assuming at this point why that would be the case. So I won't answer on that behalf. We did see quite a few deletions, but because those customers had utilized the Fabric's ability to actually manipulate the source systems, that wasn't seen as such an abrasive and disruptive type of operation. But these kind of queries that were removing data, they went through the CluedIn workflow system of approval to really make sure that the right product owner was actually approving these types of processes. I think due to time, we could probably end it with probably the questions, and so I will leave it off to Mikkel to see you all off.
All right, that wraps it up. Thank you very much. As mentioned in the beginning, we'll be sending out the slides for this webinar. I guess all that's left is to thank you very much for attending, and I wish you all a very pleasant day.